Why was Anthony Albanese shaking hands with the man whose regime is accused of genocide? Xi Jinping is proving power is everything. The world can't ignore him. His self-proclaimed best friend, Vladimir Putin, is threatening nuclear war on Ukraine. Tonight, are our interests more important than our morals? Welcome to Q&A. Thank you for that welcome. I'm Stan Grant, here to give you some answers. One of the world's leading experts on war studies from King's College London, Sir Lawrence Freedman. Former Treasurer and former US Ambassador Joe Hockey. Writer, filmmaker and historian Santilla Chingaipe. Chair of the Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee, Peter Khalil. And Chief Foreign Affairs columnist at the Financial Times, Gideon Rachman. Please make them all feel welcome. A lot to get through tonight, a very big week in international affairs. We're going to get to your questions on the threats of nuclear war, also losing everything in the floods, and Donald Trump's run for president. Can he defy the odds again? And remember, you can live stream us around the country on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved. Let's get started tonight. Here's a question from Bob Vinicum.
After the Holocaust of World War II, we all said never again. So why is Albanese shaking hands and smiling with the Chinese dictator Xi, while the genocide against the Tibetans, the Uyghurs and the Falun Gong practitioners is still going on?
Santilla, what did you think when you saw
It's a very good question, and one that should be put to the Prime Minister and this government. Obviously these sorts of things are very complicated, and China and Australia's relationship has had a bit of a rough patch the last couple of years, and I can see that, this government's trying to sort of repair some of that, and that was probably part of that, and I think these things are complicated. But I do think that a big part of these conversations that happen within diplomatic circles are about symbolism, and it does say something to be seen publicly shaking hands with someone whose government is accused of very serious human rights violations, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs and various other things, including as well as, dual Australians that are in detention in China, who, many believe should be brought home. And these are concerns that that are very worrying. And, I agree. I think why was the Prime Minister shaking hands with the leader of a country that has a very questionable human rights track record?
Peter.
Look, this is the first formal meeting between the Chinese leader and Australian leader in some 6 years. And these international summits, they're the pinnacle, I guess, of international affairs where world leaders meet, they interact in this rarefied atmosphere, really. And what they do and discuss really has an impact on shaping the world we live in. The Prime Minister in meeting President Xi was an important meeting because dialogue is good. Making sure that we talk with...
Did he have to look so happy to be doing it? There was a big smile on his face.
Well, I mean, you can make that kind of criticism about a Prime Minister's face, but the important thing is, in the meeting, he was very clear that he would not resolve from Australia's national interests or our values, our democratic values, including human rights. And in the meeting itself, which, as I said, it hasn't happened for such a long time, it was important that he put forward Australia's interests around removing trade barriers, around human rights, which he did, around the detained Australians. And that's important. Now, that's up to the Chinese government to move the relationship forward. The ball's pretty much in their court. But the interesting thing about this is that Prime Minister Albanese has really practiced a nuanced diplomacy. In the past, I've been critical of the previous government because, they've been quite bellicose, beating their chest, scoring domestic political points. But the Prime Minister's engagement is important because it's about the world that we live in. And at these international summits, it's important to actually put Australia's position forward and our contribution to shaping that world that we live in.
I'm going to bring Joe in just a minute, though. First, I want to bring someone in who has experienced China's treatment of Uyghur people, Saddam Abdusalam. Saddam, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Stan.
Tell us a little bit about your story. You were actually on Q&A a couple of years ago and you were concerned then about your family. You've been reunited with your wife. You've since had another child. But tell us about your situation and leaving China and the concerns you have.
It's pretty shocking, especially for my wife, who was suffered for 3.5 years, and my newborn son. He was 3 years at the time, so I couldn't meet them, and only way to contact with them is via in WeChat moment. And yeah, it was pretty tough, but at the end, it's all done now. I've got the family here. My wife is safe. My son is safe. I've got a newborn son. And the only thing is, like, my wife's still struggling with like what's happening in China. Like, for example, if she sees the police officers or sirens, even like bring her memory back, like what she been going through in China.
And Saddam, you still have family there as well, who are actually held in some of these camps that were
my
accused of
dad's
genocide.
brother, my cousin. To be honest, we don't even know she's in prison on the camp, but we haven't heard from him. And I lost all the contacts from my relatives. They all deleted me from the WeChat. Apparently, contacting with the overseas people put them in danger. So they all deleted me from the WeChat. So I don't have any information from my relatives at the moment.
What question would you like to put to our panel?
I mean, I know Mr. Albanese raised the question about Cheng Lei and Dr. Yang. But how about the Uyghur Australian families? Like my friend Almas, he hasn't heard from his wife for 5 years now. And there's a girl called Mikrai. She was born and raised in Melbourne and a healthcare worker. And her husband was sentenced for 25 years in jail. And there's so much Australian Uyghurs separated from their family members. And how about them?
Peter.
I'm actually familiar with Saddam's case. I think I met with him a while back in Canberra or in Parliament. It's our actually responsibility as representatives in a democracy to stand in solidarity with the Uyghurs, with people who are suffering human rights abuses. And I've spoken in Parliament on multiple occasions in defence of people who are suffering these human rights abuses. I think it's an important element of our foreign policy that human rights is front and centre. When we talk about the international rule of law, that includes human rights and a commitment to it. It includes the commitment that we make to protect people, including refugees and others. So that's part of our foreign policy. Penny Wong, our Foreign Minister, has been pretty clear about the importance of that. The Prime Minister has been clear about the importance of that. I guess the question goes to, in not speaking to the Chinese leader for such a long time, is it beneficial to the national interest to have that conversation on human rights?
Let me put that question to Joe Hockey. Did it help the Uyghurs that Australia was in the deep freeze during the Morrison years?
No.
So did that,
How
did that say that Australia
do you
got
change behaviour if you don't speak to someone about their behaviour? So if we're not in conversation with China, which, by the way, is our biggest trading partner, and there's, 1 million Chinese Australians living here, we're going to stop talking to China, to the leader of China?
But that's precisely what happened during the Morrison government, where the mistakes made here that led to that impeded the ability to have these conversations.
Well, they started under the Turnbull government, by the way, which is,
same political stripe.
Well, that's true, but I mean, it was very good under Abbott. So, look, whatever the case, Australia's been doing the right thing. It's been standing up to a bully, and we won't be bullied by China. And whoever's the Prime Minister, whether it's Anthony Albanese or Scott Morrison or Turnbull or Abbott, whoever it is, they're putting Australia's interests first. We call it the national interest. What it is Australia's self-interest. And it is in our self-interest, our national interest, to communicate with China. Of course it is.
Gideon, if you're listening to Saddam, and others as well, we heard the first question from Bob Vinicum. Is there a trade-off here? Do you say that a country like China is just too powerful, too important to ignore, even if we find aspects of their human rights odious?
Well, I think it's inevitably a complicated relationship because it is such a powerful country in military terms. You have the economic relationship and you have the human rights aspect. And you're never going to allow one of those to completely overshadow the other two. You have to keep them all in balance
when you're
to some
talking
extent.
about genocide, which is what China has been accused of with the Uyghurs, can you look past genocide to shake hands and smile because it's an important trade relationship?
Look, I think the reality is that is what everybody is doing. Nobody has cut off relations with China completely. But I think it's also not the case to say that China's getting off completely scot-free, even on the Uyghurs. I mean, if you look in Europe, they lost a very important trade deal with Europe that they'd been working on for a couple of years on precisely this issue. There was a tit-for-tat. The Europeans sanctioned some Chinese officials because of what they were doing in Xinjiang. The Chinese counter-sanctioned, and at that point, the European Parliament said, we're not going to let this trade deal go through. So it's not the case that it's all flannel and we say we raised human rights and then it's business as usual. I think the Chinese have paid a price and they'll continue to pay a price for what they're doing.
But Sir Lawrence, as someone who studies war, does this remind us that we have a power-based order and that can prove right, or might at least proves that you have to be listened to?
Might proves that you have to be listened to. You can't ignore another's power. You get into trouble if you do. And we've got to be clear, this is not just a China problem. We've got an issue with Saudi Arabia, you've got an issue with Qatar running the World Cup. What sort of relationship are we going to have with Russia after what it's been doing to Ukraine? So it's not unique to China. And I think in all these cases, I think the starting point should be confidence in our own systems, in our own values, a recognition that we haven't always been to the top in meeting the standards that we sometimes set for others, and got to be careful about the risk of hypocrisy and double standards. So it's always going to be a balance, as everybody has said. But I think the starting point should be confidence in ourselves and in our own system, and that's the starting point. And let them work out how they have to deal with us, rather than we spend all our time working out how to deal with them.
So Lawrence has mentioned Russia. It's another big topic, of course. Let's hear now from Mikhail Sven.
Thanks, Dan. After having traveled through Eastern Europe, and particularly Ukraine, to visit family and friends, it's utterly heart-wrenching to witness the destruction that Russia's war is having on both Ukrainian citizens as well as global citizens. Global support among countries and individuals has been outstanding and welcomed. My question to the panel is, what do you think it'll take to stop this war?
Sir Lawrence.
I wish we had a clear sense of how you stop this war. The person who can stop it is Vladimir Putin. He's the one who's invaded, tried to conquer territory, tried to subjugate a people, and failed to do that, but not failed enough so that his forces have been pushed out. Unfortunately, I think the difficulty we're in is that any negotiated outcome at the moment that satisfies Ukrainian demands, which is simply to be an independent sovereign state without somebody else occupying their territory, isn't a demand that can be met by Putin. And even if he agreed to a withdrawal, the backlash in Russia could be very severe. So my concern at the moment is that Putin would rather this war drags on than...
Yeah, you've made that point, haven't you, before, that Putin needs it to drag on. The alternative is potentially the end of his own rule.
Indeed, I think what he would like would be a victory. He can't get a victory now, so maybe a draw would be better. But the main thing is, as far as he is concerned, that he doesn't have the reckoning that would come when the Russian people have to confront the loss of life, the loss of reputation, the loss of markets that this war has cost them, as well as, in a sense, face the criminality with which this war has been conducted. It's easier to keep it going. It's almost easier if the Ukrainians push Russian troops out, because at least he can blame NATO, say it's their support that's made it possible, rather than him making that critical concession that 4 provinces that he claims to be part of Russia are never now going to be part of Russia.
Gideon, what about the nuclear option? It's been raised, it's been certainly feared. Is it possible?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, certainly talking to American decision makers, British decision makers, I've been very struck by how absolutely central to their thinking the threat of Russia using a nuclear weapon is. I mean, a figure, I don't know how realistic these figures are, but I heard in Washington was a 25% chance that they might use a nuclear weapon. Now, we think of that as, immediate catastrophe. Some of them are saying that they might use actually quite a small nuclear weapon.
What they call tactical battleground
nuclear weapons, which would kill hundreds rather than thousands. But the psychological
You're
shock,
crossing a threshold.
Absolutely. And of course, the Americans have said in response, without specifying exactly what they would do, that Russia would suffer catastrophic consequences, which implies a military response. And then, of course, if that were to happen, you have the threat of escalation into something much bigger. So, you know, I think it's actually appropriate that the Americans are concerned about this. Some people say to use the jargon they use there, they've self-deterred, that they have been too cautious in their support for Ukraine. For example, limiting the range of the missiles they give to the Ukrainians so they can't strike directly into Russia.
So they're not giving a pretext. They're not giving Putin an excuse. Yeah. But, Joe, you talk to similar people that Gideon talks to in Washington. What would America do if we did see, in fact, the use of nuclear weapons?
Well, it would be a massive conventional response. They will not...
Directly against Russia?
Against Russia, yeah. And it would be all the land forces, Russian land forces in Ukraine, and probably a vast number of Russian ships in strategic locations. This has been a disaster for Russia. Now it has created an instability.
And for the Ukrainian people.
Well, of course for the Ukrainian people, but for Russia, which is such a powerful and influential nation, this is a generational disaster. Their great fear was NATO's expansion. What we've seen out of this is they are now in a war with a country that is funded, trained, and basically all the intelligence is provided by NATO. And at the same time, Finland and Sweden are going into NATO. They've now lost a big chunk of control of the Arctic, which is bad for China as well. And Putin has found that the much lionised Russian military is in fact full of corruption and dislocation, and it is a real threat to the world.
Santilla, when you look at this, how do you see an end, to go back to the question?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. But what is interesting is, you know, just hearing how we're talking about this, and I'm sort of like, we're talking about human beings as well. And it's sort of this idea that, you know, there's winners and losers, but ultimately there's been a massive loss of life. There's been a clear economic impact, which we're feeling here in Australia as well. And the longer this drags out, the worse it just gets. And it's just really devastating all round. And it's just really just devastating. Well,
it's interesting you talk about people directly affected. I want to come to you just a minute, Peter, because we do have someone who is absolutely affected by it. Galia Vaskudanova is with us tonight. Now, you've been in Australia for about 3.5 months and you fled Ukraine. You were telling me before we came on about the scene at the train station when you were trying to get out. What was that like?
Yeah, so when I decided to evacuate, I decided it when they bombed area close to my house, you know, just less than 1 kilometer from my house. They bombed our TV tower, and part of Russian missiles just fell 200 meters from my house and destroyed the building here. So I decided to evacuate. Yeah. And when we came with my mom to train station, it was completely full of people. Some of people just spent several nights there because they couldn't get on to the train, you know.
And you couldn't get on?
I couldn't get on. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where we will sleep because it was 13th day of the war, and most of accommodation in all western cities in Ukraine were completely full. I looked for accommodation and I didn't find it, and I also didn't know where to go. So we decided just to go in the western direction, in some city anywhere, and just find some place there. And when we were lucky and we get on the train, and it was completely full. People were sitting on the floor, even on a train vestibule. Do you know what I mean? And so we were just with small backpack because it was impossible to get on the train with the luggage, you know, and most of people lost it. And so when I was already on the train, I messaged my friend that I don't know where to go, and she told me I'll ask my friends. And in 5 minutes, some guy who has never seen me before called me and told me, you can stay in my apartment as much as you need. And we stayed there 3 months with my mom.
You got out, but your mum is still there. Are you in contact with her? How is she?
Yeah, I'm in contact with my mom, and She didn't want to go to Australia because it could be quite difficult for her because she doesn't speak English, and so now I'm really worried about my mom because situation is getting worse, you know, because winter is coming and Russia try to do like huge humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. They bomb all our infrastructure all the time, and now lots of city without electricity, no heating, no water. Also in my mom's city, from time to time, in Kyiv, from where I am, you know, sometimes no water, no electricity, no heating. So it's getting worse. Just 2 days ago, they launched more than 100 missiles to Ukraine, you know.
And Khalil, you have a question directly for Peter Khalil. He's here from the government tonight. What is that question?
I don't really have question. I just want to ask you, please give more weapons to Ukraine. I know Australia has already helped a lot, but we are fighting not for our country. We are fighting for democracy, for human rights, for all Western values, for Western world, for all Western world. Just help us, you know. And also one more thing which I want to ask you. You stopped a humanitarian program for Ukrainians. Now we are not allowed to apply for humanitarian visas, but situation is getting worse. Winter is coming, so please reopen this program, because I want my friend, I want my family to join me here and apply for humanitarian visa.
Thank you, Khalil. Good luck to your mum as well. Send her best wishes if you get to talk to her. And Peter.
Thank you, Khalil, for sharing your story and the horrible experience that you've been through. And I'm glad Santilla raised the human dimension as well. We've heard it firsthand from you, because we talk about the invasion, we talk about the breach of the UN Charter, we talk about these abstract principles, you know, a dictator invading a smaller neighbour, a smaller country, but they have laid waste to Ukraine. Tens of thousands of people have died. Their own soldiers have died.
But the direct question was, what are you going to do to help people just like Leah and her friends?
And the humanitarian program, I'll check on that, because we did open up additional humanitarian places and visas for Ukrainians. That's something that's been in consideration. On the aid, Australia is one of the largest non-NATO military contributor to Ukraine. We continue to provide support that's in constant consideration. We made further announcements about trainers for Ukrainian forces. There's additional humanitarian aid. That's important. It's important that we continue that assistance, because I agree with you. You are fighting on the front line for democracy, for the values that we talk about tonight, like human rights and democracy. People are dying for that on the ground, and it's really our responsibility and obligation to support you in that effort. As the international community has supported Ukraine, it's been a remarkable effort to support Ukraine in this struggle to defend their lives, to defend their country, and we need to do more, and we'll continue to look at the aid that we provide.
Just on doing more, Sir Lawrence, what more could be done? Because there have been at times direct calls for foreign troops to go into Ukraine and fight on the ground.
So that takes us back to the nuclear issue, because to some extent it's a myth that nuclear weapons haven't been used in this conflict. They've been used right from the start by Putin, because the threat that he has posed is to raise the nuclear issue if there is direct foreign engagement in support of the Ukrainians, not the assistance that we're all given, for which we should give more, but troops on the ground. And that has been respected by NATO. Nuclear deterrence has worked, which is one reason why I'm not sure he would want to jeopardise that. And then we've also heard how you don't need nuclear weapons to terrorise a population. There are all sorts of other ways by which you can make life miserable. And then you come to the conclusion, following from the previous question about negotiations, if that's difficult, then the only way to bring this quickly to an end is to give Ukraine the maximum amount of support. I don't think we're going to...
What does that...
Well, I think, you know, they need modern tanks. They could do with some more aircraft. They need ammunition.
And the Europeans have to step up.
Well,
I mean, they've been terrible.
No, I don't think that's wholly fair.
Well, no, I don't think it is. The Americans have spent $25 billion helping Ukraine. Britain has spent $5 billion, And if you exclude Poland, Britain's contribution of $5 billion is more than the rest of Europe combined. The rest of Europe combined.
I'll go to Gideon on that. What more should or could be done? And Gideon, to that original point, how or even when does this end?
Well, I mean, on the military front, I think, you know, it's right that Europe, and particularly Germany, has been very, very hesitant for their own historical reasons. They're very antsy about getting involved with German tanks shooting at Russian troops. It's kind of, but I think they need to get over it, really. They've been...
And the French.
Yeah, the French a little bit been a bit more forward, but I mean, Lawrence would know more than I about exactly what kit's been provided. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, there's a danger for the West in that now you have a Republican House. They'll begin to say, you know, this war's actually in Europe. How come America's spending more, America's sending more? And so the Europeans are going to have to shift.
It's a very interesting question about who pays for what and how much countries pay for their military. And that takes us to our next one, actually. Rory Keys is with us. Rory?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. As a former Army officer who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, I note that former ALP leader and Minister of Defence Kim Beazley called for an increase in the defence spending as a proportion of the budget. In light of the war in Ukraine and the increasing tensions in the Asia-Pacific, is the conversation with the Australian public honest about what's required for a credible defence posture going in the coming decades?
I'll bring you in on this, Joe, because you were just making the point about European nations. When you look at our region as well, is Australia going to have to spend a lot more on military? It's increasing already, but how high will it have to go?
Well, it may have to go towards 3% of GDP, which is, another 50% increase, basically. And why? Because increasingly, whoever has the technology has the advantage in wars. And we are fighting now not just, troops to troops, but look at the cyber attacks on Australia, which have come from malevolent countries, right? So we've got cyber attacks, space is increasingly expensive, and there's a big battleground in space. And then, from time to time, there's a whole lot of other areas where we could see activity. We've got to keep up on artificial intelligence, quantum computing. And Australia has the brains to do it. We've got a lot of great businesses here that are actually quite influential. We've just got to find a way to invest more in them.
And we have to find the money, don't we, Peter Khalil? Yeah, because we know that we just had the budget come down, and we know that it's going to be difficult to pay for things like healthcare, National Disability Insurance Scheme, aged care. If you're taking money out of other areas to put into defence, how do you pay for the rest?
Healthcare, NDIS, all of these things cost a lot of money, and we were left with $1 trillion debt. I'm not going to have a cheap shot at Joe because he was Treasurer a long time ago, but we were left with $1 trillion debt.
I tried to pay it off, mate.
Oh, did you? OK. But the issue for us is really clear. There are 3 Ds, and I really appreciate the question, and thanks for your service. There are 3 Ds. There's defence, diplomacy and development assistance, if you like, as tools of statecraft. Not one of them on their own actually works. They have to work in coordination, and that's why the diplomacy piece is so important, but it's got to be backed up with strong defence capability. Why? Why do we have to have that defence capability? We need to be able to deter state actors, non-state actors from seeking to, attack our interests in the region and diminish that rules-based order. The law of the sea, for example, is important for us as a trading nation. We need to have those naval capabilities to protect the sea lanes and have freedom of navigation. This all costs money. We've got a baseline of 2% spending as a percentage of GDP. It's increasing. It's going up to 2.2, I think, next year. But big decisions are being made by the government come March.
Joe said 3. Yeah. Could you imagine it under the government that you're now in, getting to that point?
So Richard Marles, our Defence Minister, has got a strategic defence review which is happening at a breakneck speed, put together by former Minister Stephen Smith and Sir Angus Houston, former CDF. They are putting forward their report. The Minister has to make some big decisions about defence capability. That's going to cost money out of the budget. But, these are big decisions that will shape our region for the rest of the 21st century in some respects. It's a bit melodramatic. But what we do now in defence and in diplomacy has a huge impact on the future of our children and our grandchildren. And so if we have to spend that additional money to make sure we get that right, we're going to have to do it.
But the question wasn't it? It was about transparency, about defence spending. And, respectfully, Joe, the previous government one of the main issues was with those submarines and those contracts, and the fact that there was so much money that was spent and it wasn't adequately accounted for or explained to the Australian public. And it is sort of like, if we are going to be spending so much money, can there at least be transparency around where that money is going and how it's being used? And I think that's something that's been missing over the years, where we haven't been informed as a public where all of that money's going and how it's being
You're right,
used.
Santilla, and I think the questioner also talked about the need to have this conversation with the Australian public. Why is it we need these capabilities? What do they do? How do they protect our national interests? Why are they important?
And of course, would we be able to, regardless of what we spend, we still need a big, powerful friend like the United States, don't we?
Yeah, there is that, but I actually, and I've written about this a fair bit, as a middle power, we need to be working collectively with partners in the region and allies, all of us together, to try and deter aggressors from undermining a rules-based order that actually benefits us. It actually works for us. We are a trading nation, and our prosperity is dependent upon nations abiding by that rules-based order, on the international rule of law, as our Prime Minister calls it. The security and stability of our region, the Indo-Pacific, is dependent on protecting that rules-based order. And there are many actors that seek to degrade it and diminish it, and we need to be able to deter them from doing that.
Yeah, and I think actually there's a connection with what we were just talking about with Russia, because if Putin is forced back, defeated in some way or another, that, I think, has an effect on this region as well, and a good effect. Because you can already see the Chinese beginning to back off a bit from this limitless friendship that they announced earlier this year with Russia, because Russia's doing badly, and it's no longer looks so advantageous from Beijing to be quite so confrontational.
But having said that, a weak Russia is a stronger China.
Certainly vis-a-vis them, yeah. Sure.
So, no, but the point is, Joe,
China is gaining an advantage out of this massive growing weakness.
They were already the senior partner in the relationship, and it's going to be greater. But the point is this: we cannot allow that kind of brutal aggression by Russia to become the norm in international system, because that's not a world that we want to live in. And as a smaller nation or a middle power, you know, we have to work collectively with our partners to ensure that their countries abide by a system that is mutually beneficial to all of us, and that actors can't get away with doing what Russia is doing.
And of course, to the point that Rory made, it's going to cost, isn't it? That's the point. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A live with Lawrence Freedman, Joe Hockey, Santilla, Chingaipe, Peter Khalil and Gideon Rachman. Let's get to some other big news this week. Here's Laura Ish.
I'm an American citizen and voter who moved to Australia in mid-2019 while Trump was in office. With Trump's campaign announcement yesterday, I'm really concerned that many people think Trump couldn't possibly get elected again, when in reality he absolutely could, even if his chances have diminished. So my question is, how do we fight complacency in an electorate where voting isn't compulsory?
Santilla.
Oh, that's a very good question. Look, I watched the announcement yesterday, which I found quite interesting. I just want to hear Joe's take on this, since I know that you played golf with Trump at some point. But
on more than one occasion.
But no, because I found his language in that press conference to be really, really quite interesting, because it seemed like a more subdued version of the Trump that we're sort of used to. And I thought that part of it was him making a point, because clearly, you know, Ron DeSantis has come to the fore as the preferred Republican candidate for 2024. And Trump is clearly playing on his popularity and the fact that he was using language that was talking about this movement and bringing the movement of people together and sort of putting himself on the backside of everything was really quite interesting. It was interesting hearing his language and how that's going to play out, and whether or not his popularity will be enough to build that momentum and get him that Republican Party support, because clearly the Republican Party see Ron DeSantis as their front runner.
Joe?
Well, it's a good point. He was very measured at the press conference.
How was he on the golf course?
You know, he's quite engaging. I mean, you know, he doesn't cheat.
Really? Really?
No, really. Bill Clinton cheats on the golf course. He likes to play the same shot 5 times.
Although of course, Donald Trump accused everyone else of cheating, didn't he?
Well, that's right, of course.
And you, Joe Hockey, said there may have been some truth to the idea that there was conspiracy at the 2020 election, didn't you?
Well, no, I didn't say that.
Oh no,
no,
I think I've got the quote. You were asked on radio. You were asked on radio, was it possible that
was it possible?
And, oh, for sure. The question is whether it is enough to change the election outcome.
Yeah.
You also questioned. You said it was hard to believe that 3% of voters in DC backed Biden. That does suggest that conspiracy is afoot, doesn't it?
Well, no, not conspiracy, because what you have is voter suppression. And you know, let's be real about it. I am strongly opposed to this voluntary voting system in the United States because it means that both parties are trying to rile up their base with the most extreme language to get them to vote. And what should happen is what happens in Australia, that we battle for the middle ground, the middle vote. In America, it's quite interesting, at the midterms, the Republicans won 5 million more votes than the Democrats in these midterms, and yet it was a close result. And it was because independent voters were abandoning the Republican Party primarily because of Donald Trump.
Well, hold on, you dodged Stan's question though, Joe, because that statement, I recall that statement at the time where you questioned the high vote for Biden. It was actually 87% in Washington,
No,
DC.
it was 94%.
No, it was actually 90% when Clinton 4 years earlier. But the problem with you making a statement like that as a former ambassador, a former senior cabinet minister, with all the disinformation and misinformation and undermining of democracy, it just added fuel to that fire. And you should have known better about that. We are facing a battle between authoritarianism and democracy around the world, and our democracies, many democracies, are being attacked at home. The disruption, the degrading, the diminishing of our systems and our values. Okay, now we've thankfully here had a really strong bipartisan pushback on that with countering foreign interference laws and other cybersecurity laws that we're building up. But we have a responsibility to actually protect and defend democracy, not to question and even skirt on the edges of conspiracy theories, and that I think is a problem.
So let me get back to the question.
Oh, you didn't.
So, you know, thanks for that, Peter.
You're welcome.
But let me just get back to it. So the fundamental issue is the Republican Party now is going to have a hell of a civil war between the Trump forces and the people that want to claim back the Bush-Reagan type of Republican Party. It's going to play out over the next 2 years, and it will be Ron DeSantis on one side and Trump on the other.
Well, I want to bring Gideon Rachman because you've written a lot about this. You've written about the strong man and the political, you know, the appeal of the political strongman. Can Trump get elected president again?
Yeah, I agree with the question. I think he can. I mean, I think it's looking less likely than it did a week ago, but I think he's still probably the front runner for the nomination, particularly if you have a large field. If it's just Trump, DeSantis, maybe he'll lose. But if it's a winner-take-all primary, there are 5 Republicans running against Trump, he can win the primaries. Then, if he gets the nomination, he's running probably against an 82-year-old Joe Biden with high inflation. You know, any Republican would have a chance of winning under those circumstances. I think we are learning that, as Joe said, that he is turning off middle ground voters. So a different Republican would have a much stronger chance. But if Trump gets the nomination, he's definitely in with a shout.
Santilla, you've lived in the United States, haven't you? You've spent significant time in the United States. I was interested in something you said, which goes to the division. And we know that it's a country that is deeply divided, whether it be class or geography or race, and that you felt unsafe there. Tell us about that.
I did. And I wrote a piece about it for The Monthly, which I essentially talked about the failure of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade travel advice, because they do give specific travel advice for queer travellers, elderly travellers, and women travellers. But when it comes to cultural, religious and racial diversity, there is no specific travel advice. And so I was travelling to a very remote part of the US, which was predominantly white. It was 98% white. And I felt, and it was 2 hours away from a town, so it was in upstate New York, it was 2 hours away from a town called Buffalo, where early in the year there was a shooting where 10 black people were killed in a race attack. And I looked to my government for advice about how to move in that environment because, you know, racism is everywhere, it's here as well, but it is very different in different contexts. And it was, how do you move in those spaces? Are you equipped? And I felt it very acutely in the US.
You felt unsafe?
I felt absolutely unsafe in that environment. In a bigger liberal city like New York or LA, it's very different because it's very diverse and there's certain spaces that you can move in. But when you are in an environment where, you know, it's very remote, it's very isolated, and you've got white people, you know, driving around in these big trucks and, you know, they've got guns. And, you know, when I'm walking down the street, I am black. I am not Australian. I am a black person in America, and that I take on everything that comes with that. And so, yeah, it was a very, very interesting experience. And it was something that I sort of thought that I wish my government thinks a lot more about. But to the question around and to the point around what's going on with the US, with democracy and the undermining of the electoral system there, particularly with the midterms, what we've seen, whether it's with the Republican Party and the gerrymandering and all of that sort of stuff, I want to ask Peter, because, you know, the Australian government, we clearly have a very close relationship with the US. That's a strategic relationship. And the way things are playing out in the US, it is going to get messy and it is going to get complicated, but we are signatory to this alliance, which makes us in many ways beholden to the political decisions that the US makes when it comes to foreign policy. And I wonder, at what point does Australia begin to rethink, or at the very least reimagine what that relationship looks like? Because, you know, with the Republican Party, someone like Ron DeSantis might not necessarily be very keen on backing Ukraine, for example, you know, and all sorts of other foreign policy decisions. And will Australia just sort of, you know, be in lockstep with the US, irrespective of the political party or the president that's in charge? And when do we start to consider our own values and sort of go, well, that's not really right?
That's a good question. I mean, I think the alliance, of course, is an important one. It's an important strategic and security alliance. There's always a debate about how independent Australia's foreign policy is, and I think, particularly under our government, we do have an independent foreign policy to the extent that we are focused on Australia's national interests. And that doesn't always align with our partners or our allies. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But the important point is that we are focused on what is important to us. And with respect to the US, I mean, you know, the previous administration, the Trump administration, there were concerns around some of the policies, some of which weren't implemented, like wanting to, you know, leave the Korean Peninsula, which would have left a hole, but things like diminishing the WTO and the rules around trade, which are important to us. You know, I was critical of that at the time. So we don't always agree with the US, and their system is decentralised. There's a lot of inconsistency in their voting, state to state, county to county. Thankfully, in Australia, we have an independent electoral commission and we have compulsory voting, which is really, really important. It gives a resilience to our democracy that some others might not have. But every democracy is different. And I think the relationship with the US is an important one. We welcome the Biden administration's commitment to the Indo-Pacific and to human rights and to a liberal rules-based order. And we're working very effectively with President Biden and his administration. But it's always about, it should always be about Australia's national interest first.
So just on Australia's national interest, who should the next ambassador to the United States go?
Well, that's a matter for the Prime Minister.
Any names that you'd like to suggest? I mean, Kevin Rudd.
Joe Hockey 2.0,
Kevin
maybe
Rudd
will say that.
Well, I thought we liked the Americans. Why would we think Kevin Rudd? I mean, it's like... I think Julia Gillard would be great, to be honest. You know, the main thing is that whoever is
what would she bring?
Oh, look, I think Julia Gillard's been exceptional since she retired as Prime Minister or lost the election, lost the job. And I think she's held herself with great dignity, and she's measured. She wouldn't. You know, the Washington Post is incredibly powerful, and you've got to be totally in lockstep with the Prime Minister. And I would urge the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister not to appoint someone who would want to run their own foreign policy out of Washington, D.C. So
you're ruling Kevin Rudd out?
I'm not ruling him out. That's a matter for Anthony Albanese. But there are a number of very good and talented people. But I would emphasise they should be a former political figure, because you can go up the hill to the Capitol Hill, and there is a dialogue between politicians that is not there between politicians and public servants. And the countries that have public servants as their ambassadors in Washington, they fall behind.
Thank you for your question, Laura. Now to the New South Wales floods, which are continuing to cause so much devastation. Here's Wendy Brooks. Hi, Wendy.
Hi. I actually lost everything in the floods this year. My home flooded 3 times. My question is, particularly as I'm still fighting with the insurance company to get anything back months later, should the government be doing more to help people who are losing everything in the floods, but in particular the lower income brackets? You know, I come from the new demographic that's rising of the women who are single, 50s to 60s. I don't have enough money to see me through to my old age, and that's no fault of my own. It's just the way circumstances have been. But as older women, we are finding that we do have a voice and we do have a vote. And if you back us into a corner, we're going to come out fighting. And I'm not sure whether the government really want to test us out.
There's a challenge.
Yeah, no, which town are you?
Hampden.
You know, obviously it's devastating for you and so many other Australians to have, you know, towns like Forbes and other towns who've had floods and then more floods months later to have to rebuild their lives, rebuild their properties, rebuild everything, to only have to go through it all over again.
That's right.
I'm not going to comment about the past. I will say that the Prime Minister we have now is committed to support for the people who've been devastated by the floods. In fact, the government has actually put forward a lot of financial assistance, $1,000 payments, one-off payments, payments for financial hardship.
You're shaking your head. You're not impressed.
Look, I got the $1,000 disaster payment and it went nowhere. Quite frankly, I'm sick of hearing this from politicians. We've got people losing everything out in Western New South Wales as we speak. I have a son in the SES who's been deployed to Deniliquin, and they're preparing Moama, who are under emergency orders now. People are going to lose everything. Eugowra, a whole township has been decimated. How the hell are they going to be able to rebuild their community? The government says all of this. Where's the money?
Yeah. The pain you're going through is traumatic and it's real. The people in Eugowra, in Forbes, all those people have gone through this again and again. Absolutely understand how devastating it's been. I know that I know you say you got some payment. There are more payments being put forward. There are 500 ADF personnel helping with the cleanup. There are more hardship and financial assistance for small businesses, for primary producers. The government is taking actions as much as it can to support the communities. And the other good thing is that the PM is actually working. You know, I'm from Melbourne, so we've got floods in Victoria as well, in northern Victoria. But, you know, the PM's working with premiers regardless of political affiliation. This is not about politics. He's not politicising it. He's working to find ways to help with the recovery. On your point about your vulnerability in that particular demographic you're in, absolutely, because the highest number of the increase in homelessness is women over 55. And the Prime Minister and myself, and I think the Housing Minister, we all grew up in public housing. We're housos. We know how important having a roof over your head is to get a good start in life. He's committed $10 billion to public and social housing. He's allocated 30,000 new public houses, but allocated 5,000 houses specifically for women in those positions because of that issue. That's a huge commitment that he's made, and there's more that he's been announcing recently.
I want to bring Sir Lawrence in here, and just picking up what Wendy said there, because it does have implications elsewhere. We were talking about the United States before and the deep division. Inequality around the world is a political fault line. It's creating more conflict, isn't it? And it makes the world ripe for the autocratic strongman, someone who speaks to that sense of grievance, doesn't it?
I mean, you've got the interaction here of two trends. One, which I still think is the consequences of the financial crisis of 10, 13 years ago, which aggravated these inequalities, and climate change. I mean, these big events are sadly not unique to Australia. They're happening around the world, especially flooding. So somehow or other, you're getting more and more stresses being put on the state.
It's obviously creating a lot more political...
creating a lot more political tension. It goes beyond populism and appeals to the strongman. I mean, I don't particularly think Trump demonstrated great affinity or interest in helping people with flood damage. I think the challenge is even more fundamental than that, which is if we are now in a situation where these extreme events are going to become much more regular, at a time when, because of COVID, because of the energy crisis and so on, standards of living are falling, this is going to put strain on all our democracies. We can see it in Europe and you can see it in this part of the world as well. And it's a challenge, I think, for all politicians to be able to speak honestly about the trade-offs and the difficulties this involves. We're about in about an hour's time in the UK to have our budget announced, which is not going to be a nice one, precisely because all of these things come together and governments at some point that have had a government that tried to deny the issue was there, then all of a sudden it comes back and hits them, and now the pain will be faced.
Santilla, it also reminds us, doesn't it? My mind goes back listening to Wendy there. My mind goes back to Hurricane Katrina and the people who were affected there. Black people, brown people, poor people. COVID, a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable as well. The most vulnerable, the most at risk.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that, Wendy, by the way. And I'm really sorry to hear that you've been through a lot these past couple of years. And I think this is really what's really frustrating about our politicians today is that, you know, respectfully again, Peter, like, you know, I know that, you know, you're representing the government and you have a lot of things that you have to say and you have to talk about policy and all of that. But at the core of what we're talking about are human beings and people that are losing their livelihoods, facing so much uncertainty. At the start of the show, we were talking about defence spending and these massive budgets. And if you're an Australian sitting at home, you're sort of going, OK, we clearly have money to spend on these things, and we're not spending on the things that are actually impacting people. And that's
actually that's the problem. But there's not enough money to go around. That's the real issue.
There seems to be money going around to defence spending,
and
a lot of people are sitting at home going, well, hang on, you know, I've just lost my home. I'm struggling to pay my bills. I think it was last week I was reading a story about a woman who has been left homeless, working 2 jobs, full-time, 6 days a week, has 3 kids, is sleeping in a car. And this is happening in Australia today. And yet we can also be having conversations about all of this spending. And I understand that it is important, and I understand
I think it's a valid point.
But it's just that sometimes there is a disconnect between when politicians are talking and what people are experiencing on the ground in real time.
I know it's easy to have a cheap shot at politicians, and go ahead, we cop it all the time. It's fair enough. But frankly, with Wendy and your experience, I know that the pain that you're going through. We've been in government for 5 months.
I don't think you do, with all due respect.
Well, you've gone through a lot of pain. There's thousands of people that are experiencing it, you know, and there is a response by a government that's 5 months old. We're putting everything we can into supporting the community. If there are other things that we can do, the PM's talking to the premiers, trying to find other ways. There's 500 ADF deployed.
You've made that point. Can I just ask Wendy, just before we move on, we're almost out of time, but Wendy, how are you bearing up at the moment?
Not well at all. I've actually been diagnosed with PTSD because of the continuation of the flood, epidemics, if you like, but also because of the treatment that I've had from the insurance. It's just been horrendous to try and get... You think you pay your premium, it's a clear case of, here I am, here's my claim, I'm going to get the money. Not so. I am having to fight for my policy and for my payout, and it is wrong. And I've gone to AFCA. They have so many claims in the process. I have been waiting since the 23rd of August for my case to be given to a caseworker. Please, give more staff to AFCA so that they can hold insurance companies accountable, because nobody is. The insurance companies are doing whatever they want to do.
Wendy, good luck. Sorry to hear what you're going through, and good luck to you and the community you're from as well. We're going to hear now from Farshid Karelapur.
Thank you, Stan. After 2 months of protests, Iranian people bravely responded with 3 days of nationwide strikes. Today is the 3rd day, and millions of Iranian people are protesting right now to end the Islamic regime. We are witnessing a full-scale revolution. The Iranian regime has forced the national football team to sing the national anthem at the World Cup and not to act in any way that shows sympathy to Iranian demonstrators. Otherwise, they don't get paid and face charges. The shameful decision by Iranian regime to issue death sentence for protesters has not scared the Iranian people, but brought new blood into their vein to fight to the end. A baffling delay in acting for people of Iran when many countries have matched their words with action. Mr. Albanese has said he's going to discuss this with other world leaders to reach a unified decision against Iran. Do we have any news from such a decision by Australian government yet?
Farshid, thank you for your question. Peter, hold that thought, because I want to go to you, Gideon, just on this. And just to get a response to what we heard there are so many aspects to this.
Sure.
And just to go earlier to the point that Sir Lawrence made about regimes and how we deal with regimes that are also critical to the world. How does this play out in Iran?
Well, I think it's a very dramatic and kind of undercovered story, actually, because there's so much else going on in the world that we've already discussed that people have not really noticed as much as they should, this incredible uprising in Iran. And I think when it first started, maybe it was undercovered because people were cynical. They thought it was crushed in 2009, it'll be crushed again. But actually, it's gone on and on and on. And I think the World Cup will be a very interesting flashpoint. I mean, there's a lot of attention now on Qatar for understandable reasons, but the presence of this Iranian team and whether they sing the national anthem, Qatar's right next door to Iran. Will supporters come over? Will there be political demonstrations at this World Cup? And maybe, along with the focus on Qatar, we should be using this opportunity to actually highlight what's going on in Iran and give some kind of moral support and maybe other forms of support to the very brave people on the streets of Iran.
I mean, I think it's important because it's not only the economic issue that was there in 2009, it's a basic human rights issue, it's a feminist issue, it's about wearing the veil, and all the regime has got is violence, as we're seeing. And they're going to have to make some decisions about as we've seen some horrific social media postings already of women being beaten up by security forces for not wearing the veil. How much can the forces of Iran do that without the questions being raised with conscripts, amongst conscripts, about what they're actually doing? So I think Gideon's absolutely right. This has been undercovered. It's potentially extremely important in good ways. Potentially, but that regime has got a lot of repression in it, unfortunately.
And Joe, we've been here before where protesters have come out and they've been crushed, and when they've looked to other countries for support, it wasn't there, including the United States. Is this a moment to bring more pressure to bear?
Well, it is. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible scene over there. If the United States stepped in, I think it might inflame it. Because then it gives the Iranian government an enemy that is external. At the moment, the enemy is within, and it's much harder for the Iranian government to go to war with its own people than it is to go to war with the United States.
But it is doing just that. People are being killed.
Well, that's right, but the protest movements are working in a way that I don't think any additional foreign pressure from the United States at this point would make a difference.
Santilla, you've made this point throughout. We're talking about human beings.
But by the way, why does the United States have to solve every problem in the world?
Well, you know...
why?
I mean, I don't think anyone's saying that, but, clearly they are a superpower and there is a lot of responsibility that comes with that. But to Stan's point, just very quickly, with the World Cup and with human rights concerns, and obviously Iran being a very big one, and Qatar as well, and, I'm a massive football fan and love the World Cup, but even this one has been a very hard one for me to get around. Very, very proud of the Socceroos for standing up and saying something and speaking about the issues that migrant workers in in Qatar, facing queer rights over there and everything. And it should be a moment for celebration, particularly for the Socceroos. You know, this is the first time we've got 4 African Australians who are going to be wearing green and gold, but it's a very difficult time because you sort of like, they're in a country where there are these questions that have to be asked, and it's just yeah, a lot.
We're almost out of time, Peter, but to go directly to what Farshid was asking, right now in 30 seconds, if I can do it,
well,
what are you going to do?
That human dimension thing, not all politicians, it's all about policy. It's also personal, it's also emotional. I've spent years working with the Iranian diaspora community and refugees, spoke in Parliament in support and in solidarity of the democracy protesters.
The question was, is there any decision to be made? What are you going to do?
Well, the PM's still overseas, so obviously when he gets back, if he's had those meetings with world leaders and there's a unified position, we'll find out. But we do have to stand up for those democracy activists, whether it's in Myanmar, whether it's in Iran, whether it's in Hong Kong, because that struggle, you know, at the very least as a democratic representative, I can stand in solidarity with those people who are standing and fighting for principles, fighting with their lives in many cases for those principles. So the least we can do is stand in solidarity with them.
Farshid, good luck as well, and to your family as well in Iran. Thank you. Thank you. That's all we have time for. Thanks to our panel, Lawrence Freedman, Joe Hockey, Santilla Chingaipe, Peter Khalil and Gideon Rachman. Please thank them. And a big thanks to those of you here and at home for shaping tonight's discussions, for also being so generous with your stories as well. Those stories that tell of the human story at the heart of so much that we were discussing here tonight. Next week we'll be live in Melbourne. We're going to discuss the NDIS. How do we put a price on supporting people with disabilities? Joining me, disability rights campaigner Elie de Marchillet, Minister for the NDIS, Bill Shorten, Shadow Assistant Treasurer Stuart Robert, the Greens Disability Rights and Services Spokesperson Jordan Steele-John, and economist Amy Oster. Go to our website, you can register there to be in the audience. I'll see you then. Good night.